Everyone has a great story in them, or at least that's how the saying goes. And I'm inclined to believe that because some of the best story ideas I've ever heard have come from people who've never picked up a pen. The sad thing is, most of those stories never get written. And I can understand why, because the very first step is the hardest. Taking that initial idea and working out how that would manifest into a complete story. So if you've got a story you want to tell, this is the video for you, because I'm going to take you step by step through the process of going from that initial idea to an outline of a story that editors will love and want to publish. To do that, I'll use the example of my latest published story, the Strix. This will be a really hands-on video where I even show you my notes that I wrote while I was writing the story. The premise of the Strix is a vampire stalking the battlefields of ancient Troy, and it's just been released in this collection of stories from Speculation Publications. If you enjoy this video and want to read the Strix for yourself, you can pick it up from the link below. I really hope you enjoy the video. So let's start with that initial idea you have. A great idea can come from almost anywhere and take a lot of different forms. It can be a location you'd like to explore, like Frank Herbert's desert world of Dune. It can be a personal experience you want to share, the way Slaughterhouse-5 built on Kurt Vonnegut's experiences of World War II. It could be nothing more than an image. George R.R. Martin was writing a sci-fi novel called Avalon when he suddenly saw wolf cubs found in the snow and a man being beheaded. He immediately gave up on Avalon and started writing a Game of Thrones. I have a really strong recollection of how the idea for the Strix came to me. Every week I get an email with a list of submission calls from authors publish. A submission call is when a publisher or journal requests stories, and this particular call was themed around vampire hunters from across history. As soon as I saw it, my brain immediately did this. The very first thing that came to me was a question. If these vampire hunters are from across history, how far back into history can I push this? Where's the earliest place I can go? The question led me to one of my favourite settings, the Age of Mythology and the Trojan War. In the same moment, the word vampire conjured images of Bram Stoker's Dracula, in particular the movie, and the scenes when Vlad Dracul is cursed at the start of the film, and the sexy dream where three vampire ladies feast on Jonathan Harker. As these two concepts came crashing together, I recalled part of the Trojan myth where the Greek soldiers are stuck on their way to Troy, and Agamemnon sacrifices his own daughter, the priestess Iphigenia, to summon the winds. I knew that had to be the start of my story, the blood of Iphigenia inadvertently creating a vampiric curse, just like Vlad Dracul. Sometimes story ideas come to me fully formed, but more often I need to play with them a bit. There are lots of ways to do this, but I usually start by posing myself questions, like, in the case of the Strix, how far can I push this idea? How far back into history can I go? How do I want this story to feel tonally? Who'd want to be a vampire hunter, and why? How can I make this vampire hunt feel personal to the characters? Is the vampire literally a vampire, or does it represent something else? What questions would you ask yourself around this kind of premise? Put them down in the comments below, I'd love to see them. Once I get to the point where I have a few interesting words or images to work with, I often try to find word associations with them. What does the word vampire mean to me? Blood? Okay. Where else is blood used? Sacrifice. Okay, blood, sacrifice, ancient Greece. Oh, the ships waiting to sail to Troy. Different people think differently. I usually do this in my head, often while doing something that keeps my body busy but leaves my mind to wander, like going for a walk or doing the dishes. But others might sit down and draw this as a mind map. Experiment and find what works for you. In the case of the Strix, this initial exploration gave me a setting, the beginnings of an opening scene, and the broad premise of hunting a vampire. I didn't have any characters other than Iphigenia, who was going to die early on. I didn't have any plot points beyond the sacrifice, and I certainly didn't know what the story was going to be about thematically. This is basically step 0. A concrete premise, but not much else. And through the rest of this video, I'll go through the evolution of this final story. I'll present this as a set of linear steps, but that's just for simplicity's sake. In reality, I bounce between the steps as I tighten my narrative and fill in the gaps. And you should too. Don't let yourself get stuck just because there's some detail you can't work out. Keep writing and it will come. Step 1. Make a commitment. Writing a story takes a lot of time, and even when you're an experienced writer, your story could still get rejected by editors. So the first thing I've learned to do when I get an idea like this is to ask myself, why do I want to write this story? What do I love about it? And what would make me stop loving it? For the Strix, I loved the idea of a vampire in the same world where gods and demigods are active on the battlefield, where the vampire is powerful, but not the most powerful being at play. This felt like such a fun and interesting twist on the classic vampire setup. I couldn't imagine setting this story anywhere else. So if for some reason I couldn't use this setting, I'd rather not write the story at all. That's foreshadowing right there. Beyond loving the concept, I really wanted to get this story published. The journal spec pub we're planning sounded really amazing, and I'm actively trying to grow my portfolio at the moment, so I only wanted to invest in this story if I had a good chance of getting it accepted. This was a bit of a worry because there were some quite strict guidelines. First, this needed to be a story about vampire hunters. I wasn't sure if vampires really existed in Greek myth, but I felt like there were enough weird monsters that I'd find one close enough. It would take some work, but I'd make it fit. Second though, the story needed to be historically accurate, other than the addition of vampires of course. This wasn't just important for the publication. I realised that if I couldn't really embed my story into that of the Trojan War, I would have failed to achieve my initial vision I fell in love with. Finally though, came the point which made me really fear I'd need to abandon the story, because the story needed to be in the format of a found journal entry or entries, with dates. This one was a worry, because I knew that journals didn't exist in 1200 BC, and in fact, neither did a calendar system the way we'd understand one today. So I needed to find a way around this, which still kept the story feeling historically accurate. This was when I moved to step 2. Do the research. Even when there aren't strict submission guidelines to adhere to, research is usually an early and important step in my process because whether I'm writing sci-fi or historical fantasy or kaiju, I like my stories to feel authentic. The research excites me because I often find little factoids which throw up new ideas. These ideas can do anything from adding colour to the narrative to completely reshaping the plot. So just like Frank Herbert getting obsessed with the Oregon sand dunes, I went deep down a Greek history rabbit hole, and what I discovered ended up really improving the story. While there were no journals in 1200 BC, with the Iliad not having been written down until 750 BC, a Mycenaean script from this era, called Linear B, has been discovered on clay tablets. This gave me the idea that the journal was actually a series of fragments of these tablets, found and translated by archaeologists. I liked the idea so much that fragments actually became the working title of the story for a while. I decided that these tablets would be dated in terms of lunar cycles, in line with ancient Greek custom, and in the meta, a historian had later translated these into BC dates, providing for the dated journal format that the editors wanted. Next, I started my search for ancient Greek vampires, but discovered that the word for vampire in modern Greek is actually taken from the relatively modern Slavic term and wouldn't have existed in ancient times. After some more research though, I discovered the Strix or Striges, a nocturnal creature transformed by witchcraft, which fed on human flesh and blood with a dark, bird-like appearance. I could almost see the Greek soldiers sitting around a campfire, trying to comprehend having seen the very first vampire and interpreting it as a Strix. More and more of the story was coming to me, and I was getting more and more excited. I now really wanted to write this story, but I also really wanted to make sure I got it published. So I did something I strongly recommend you do if you're ever in this kind of situation. I emailed the editors to ask them what they thought of the idea. The response came in just a few days and it was really positive. I was so relieved, not least of all because I'd been so excited that I hadn't waited for the response and had already started on step 3. Start writing. Now, I say this step 3 because it's when the bulk of the writing begins, but from the very first idea, I usually start writing things down, both so I don't forget anything important, and secondly, because the very act of writing usually helps with the idea development, prompting more questions and more areas for research. As you can see on screen, I usually do this straight into a Word document I'm going to use for draft 1. Sometimes I'm writing full prose and dialogue, sometimes summaries of possible scenes, just whatever works to best capture the idea. I usually do this in the order I think these snippets would appear in the final story, and then I'll usually leave a big gap or a note if I think there's story missing in between 2 of the points. With this story, because I knew it was going to be presented as a series of found fragments, I roughly guessed how many of these fragments it might take in total for me to tell the whole story, and used this to space out the material I had so I could physically see the gaps. Writing down these scene ideas almost always generates some new ones, but eventually I hit a wall, with a lot of blanks still left. This is usually when I'll move on to step 4, trying to apply some kind of storytelling theory or structure to help me generate the extra ideas I need. Theorist K.M. Weiland says there are 3 key pillars to story, and this is how I try to think about my stories too. There's plot, which is to say the stuff that happens, the characters, by which I mean not just a cast of people, but their personalities and how their behaviours develop or arc through the story. Finally, there's theme, the stuff that lurks deep beneath the surface. A story is all of these coming together. This can feel like a lot, and this is the point at which most stories get abandoned. If you don't apply any structure or theory, there's a risk your story will become full of contradictions and bloat, making it impossible to finish. If you do apply structure, there are a lot of options to choose from, like the 3-act structure, Dan Harmon's story circle, archetypal story beats, and character arcs. But this can be overwhelming in itself. If I'm stuck, especially in story planning, I'll usually start with the golden triangle method, which is described brilliantly in James Scott Bell's book, Write Your Novel from the Middle. The reason this approach is so powerful is it focuses on the protagonist and makes you think about their character and the plot at the same time. That also might sound like too much, but the trick with this technique is that it only asks you to think about 3 key points that frame the story. So while this approach is very far-reaching, it's also very simple and fast to get started. Here's how it works. The 3 key points for your protagonist are the ghost, an event which happens before the story, but fundamentally shapes their behaviour through the story. A resolution at the end of the story, which gives you a glimpse of how they've changed and what their life will look like in the future. And a mirror moment at the middle, where they metaphorically or literally look in a mirror and take ownership of their destiny, and set into motion the rest of the events of the story. Bell suggests starting with this mirror moment. I had already decided that my protagonist wasn't going to start out as a vampire hunter. After all, no one in ancient Greek had heard of a vampire yet, so he'd need to become one. It felt right that this was the decision he'd take at the mirror moment, suddenly becoming proactive in the story. Now I went back to asking myself questions. Okay, he decides to hunt a vampire, but what makes that decision tough or interesting? Could we make this decision more tragic, more personal? What if the vampire in question was someone he loves? A lover? No, I want the character's journal to be addressed to his lover, so that won't work. How about a member of his family? Or how about a best friend? I like that one. So I went back to the research. One of the most famous stories of the Trojan War is the story of Achilles and Patroclus, childhood friends and possible lovers who came to a tragic end due to the former's pride. Wouldn't it be interesting to have a story about another set of childhood friends, but whose relationship goes in a very different direction? Instead of a demigod and his companion, who remain devoted throughout, two best friends who grow apart and are pushed into conflict by a vampiric curse. As this idea crystallized in my mind, two characters came to me, Theodorus and Brotius, two childhood friends who dreamed their whole lives of going on an adventure and becoming heroes together, but who come to tragedy after Brotius is transformed into a vampire. And in this mirror moment, Theo realizes he's the only one who can stop Brotius. Now I go back to the ghost and another question, a version of which you must ask yourself when writing the ghost. What happened in Theo's past that makes this mirror moment so important and personal to him? Drawing again from my research, especially the stories of Achilles and Patroclus, and a later pair, Alexander the Great and Hephaestion, I came up with some backstory, which I knew very little of would actually make it into the final cut, but would inspire it. Theo and Brotius grew up together on the same island and were like brothers, until Theo's father became an ambassador to another Greek city-state, and they moved away. This was childhood's end for Theo, and he hated his life in that other place. His friend Brotius literally represents childhood and happiness to him, so seeing him turn into a monster and then having to kill him is the most terrible burden he can imagine. But what else? How can this go deeper? How could I make this more personal to more of my characters? One of the story beats with the greatest potential for symbolism and tragedy was the death of Iphigenia. So, what if she was part of this ghost too? What if, in their teens, Theo and Brotius had been briefly reunited? My research told me that a common practice amongst ancient Greek nobility was to be sent as teenagers to sacred places like the island of Samothrace to be inducted into cults of the Greek gods. What if Theo, Brotius, and Iphigenia had all been part of the same initiation? And what if Brotius and Iphigenia had become lovers? This idea made everything start coming together. Theo and Brotius reunited on their way to Troy, living their dream of going on a heroic adventure together. Iphigenia, now a priestess, being summoned there. Theo initially being jealous of Iphigenia, fearing she'd take Brotius's attention from him. Iphigenia being sacrificed by her father Agamemnon, and Brotius being forced to drink her blood as part of that ritual. Brotius slowly becoming a monster, which Theo discovers as girls going missing from the camp and body parts found buried on the beaches. Theo, as the only one who really understands what's happening, having to hunt his friend. There was still a lot of details to work out, but I liked this. I had the sexually charged Bram Stoker tone I was looking for, and it gave me a start to my story, along with a bunch of backstory. I don't want to spoil the ending, so I won't say what happens, but I will say a little about how I worked it out to complete my golden triangle. Taking stock of what I had these two close friends whose happy reunion is shattered by seeing Iphigenia murdered by her father. One of them becomes a vampire and the other will have to reluctantly hunt his friend. Suddenly, the theme of the story came clear. It was the inversion of a coming-of-age story. It was a story about how relationships change over time. And it was a story about how we always long for our first friends and first lovers, no matter how much we drift apart from them, or even come into conflict with them. At that moment, I knew Theodorus's last words in the story, as he finished etching it into the tablets, would have to be, with Proteus by my side. Was it because they were both vampires by the end? Was it because they were both cured? Or would they lay together in a shared tomb? I won't spoil the ending for you, but I will tell you I knew what it had to be right then and there. The rest of the story was relatively easy to write. Yes, there was still a lot of work to do. I needed to work out the other key plot points, like how Proteus would drink the blood, how Theo would work out he was the vampire, and how the final fight would go down. But I now had a really strong sense of the plot beats at the beginning, middle, and end. I knew the dots I needed to join. I knew my protagonist and his character arc, and I knew the deep theme of the story, the stuff way down beneath the waterline that makes the whole thing work. Step 5 is filling in the gaps, refining what you've got, making sure it all fits together. Perhaps testing it using some of those other theory tools I mentioned. That's the writing of the story, but in terms of evolving it to a place where it's ready to be written, where there is a story to write, this is where today's video ends. But before it ends, can I ask you to just pause the video for a second? Think about your own writing. Think about any idea you're stuck with, and let me know in the comments below anything I can do to help. Like I said before, I'll put a link to the Vampire Hunters anthology in the description below. I found the team at Speculation Publications to be really lovely people, running a really nice independent press. So if you are curious to read the story, please do support them and pick up a copy. And until next time, keep writing.